Most people die at 25, but are only buried at 75. Are you just lasting, or are you really living? The money you don't have today is the result of the knowledge you still haven't applied because you told yourself you would do it tomorrow. Today, you will discover through this story how this small phrase is building the wall of your extreme poverty. Marcos was a man of grand dreams, the kind who drew entire empires in old notebooks during silent dawns. He felt the pulse of ambition in his veins and firmly believed that success would knock on his door at any moment. However, there was an invisible anchor that kept his feet stuck to the cold floor of his small living room. Every great idea that arose was immediately filed away under the pretext that it needed a little more time. He didn't realize that this passive waiting was turning his potential into an unbearable burden to carry alone. The feeling of being almost someone important was what consumed him most from the inside, creating an anguish that sleep could never cure. He looked at the opportunities passing before his eyes and whispered to himself that Monday would be his great restart. It was a vicious cycle where planning replaced execution, turning his will into a lifeless, motionless plaster statue. The weight of knowing he was capable, yet seeing his bank account empty, was a silent torture he accepted every day. Little did he know that time was charging high interest for every decision he avoided making. With each sunset, Marcos felt that a part of his youth and vital energy slipped away without leaving any concrete trace. He saw himself trapped in a labyrinth of good intentions that never translated into real results or financial freedom. His friends no longer took him seriously, and even his own thoughts began to mock his lack of attitude toward life. Scarcity was ceasing to be just a financial condition and becoming an identity he could no longer escape. While he lost himself in perfect excuses, something much darker began to rise on the horizon of his stagnant routine. The comfort of an old couch and the cheap distraction of screens became Marcos's preferred anesthetics against the pain of mediocrity. He convinced himself that he deserved that rest, even without having achieved anything relevant during the day that passed. This false sense of security is what keeps the ambitious mind in a state of deep and dangerous numbness. The human brain is a master at creating comforting narratives to justify the lack of courage and total inertia. While he felt protected in his bubble, the world outside continued to reward only those who acted. Marcos's hope was not a driving force, but rather a mirage that kept him from seeing the abyss ahead. He believed that destiny would conspire in his favor without him having to lift a single finger. This passive waiting is the cruelest form of self-sabotage because it feeds the dream while killing the capacity for execution. He saw others growing and prospering, but credited their success to luck or privileges he did not have. What he didn't understand was that luck is merely the meeting of preparation and opportunity. Scarcity began to manifest not only in his wallet, but in the sparkle of his eyes that slowly faded. With every missed opportunity, a part of his self-confidence was buried under the rubble of promises he had not kept to himself. The fear of failing became greater than the burning desire to win, paralyzing any attempt at real change. He was becoming a spectator of his own life, watching the movie of his failure in slow motion and high definition. However, an unexpected encounter on a gray afternoon was about to tear the veil of this constant illusion. Walking down a busy street, Marcos spotted an old schoolmate who now exuded an aura of success and absolute power. The contrast between them was so violent that Marcos felt a tightness in his chest, a bitter mix of envy and deep shame. The friend did not wear expensive clothes merely to show off, but as armor of someone who had earned the right to be at the top. In that brief encounter, the silence between the two said more than any long, detailed conversation ever could. Marcos realized that time had passed the same way for both of them, but the results were brutally different. When asked what he had been doing, Marcos choked on the old excuses that always worked in his empty head. He tried to talk about his future projects and the ideas that were still on paper, but the words sounded hollow and without credibility. The friend looked at him with a compassion that hurt more than a direct insult or physical aggression. "The problem," the friend said calmly, "is that you still believe you have all the time in the world at your disposal." That sentence echoed like thunder. knocking down the defenses Marcos had spent years building around himself. He returned home in a trance, feeling the weight of every tomorrow he had ever spoken in his life. The bathroom mirror now reflected a stranger, a man who had allowed laziness to devour his most sacred potential. He could no longer ignore the fact that his poverty was a choice made in every minute of hesitation. The comfort of his couch now felt like thorns, and the distraction of his phone now seemed like a corrosive and lethal poison. The realization finally hit, but the pain of discovery brought with it a disturbing doubt about his next step. Marcos began to dissect each of his failures, realizing that procrastination was just the tip of a much deeper iceberg. He understood that postponing tasks was a way to protect his ego from the paralyzing fear of not being good enough. Every time he said tomorrow, he was, in fact, fleeing from the judgment the world might pass on his work. This constant escape created a cycle of anxiety that prevented him from seeing the obvious way out of that miserable situation. He was addicted to the immediate relief of giving up, ignoring the bitter price he would pay in the long run for it. The cycle of failure worked like a perfectly lubricated gear by mental exhaustion and the lack of a clear purpose. He started the day with a mental list of goals, but soon got lost in trivial tasks that generated no progress. By late afternoon, the feeling of guilt crushed him, leading him to seek refuge in momentary pleasures that only increased his frustration. He realized that his mind was trained to prioritize quick comfort instead of the lasting reward of achievement. It was a defense mechanism that, although it seemed safe, was systematically destroying any chance for him to prosper. He noticed that his poverty was not only financial, but a moral and intellectual bankruptcy that fed on his inertia. The excuses that once seemed logical now sounded like childish and shameful lies he told himself. He saw that he was digging an ever deeper hole, where hope died a little with each setting sun. The awareness of his own sabotage brought a rage he had never felt before, a spark of revolt against the man he had become. However, anger alone would not be able to change the direction his life was heading. Marcos understood that to kill the failed man, he would first need to destroy the excuses that fed his wounded pride. He decided that he would no longer accept comfort as a reward for work he had not even begun to do. The first step was recognizing that he was the only one responsible for the mud in which his feet were sunk up to his ankles. This clarity brought unbearable pain, but it was the only pain that could finally awaken him from his deep, lethargic sleep. He stopped blaming the economy, his family, or destiny, and began to look at his own hands. The change began with small choices, the ones no one sees, but that shaped the character of those who decide to win in life. He replaced nighttime distraction with intense study on how to generate real value for the people around him. Every minute of focus was a battle won against the inner voice that still whispered for him to rest just a little. He learned that discipline is not a punishment, but the freedom of someone who is no longer a slave to their own basic impulses. The ego, which once demanded recognition without effort, was now being tamed by the brute force of a new will. He began to work in silence, without announcing his goals to a world already tired of hearing his empty promises. Solitude became his workshop, where he forged a new identity based on relentless execution and the end of hesitation. He realized that poverty was losing control over him as his mind became a territory of order and clarity. The environment around him was still the same, but the way he interacted with reality had changed forever. However, he would soon discover that the world would test his new posture in the harshest and most unexpected way possible. Marcos's new routine was soon hit by a wave of fatigue that tried to drag him back into the abyss of inertia. The voice of self-sabotage, now more subtle, said that he had already done enough and that a small rest would not hurt. It was the final test of his character, resisting the seduction of mediocrity when financial results were not yet visible. He felt the pressure of an environment that still saw him as the failed man of a few months earlier. Every invitation to waste time was a trap disguised as friendship that he needed to learn to refuse firmly. Maintaining discipline in the dark, without applause or external validation, was the most brutal challenge he had ever faced in his life. He realized that the world does not change overnight just because you decided to change your mindset and actions. The system around him desperately tried to pull him back to the level of mediocrity where everyone felt comfortable. He had to learn to live with the solitude of those who choose a path that most fear to walk out of cowardice. Scarcity still knocked on his door, but now he no longer opened it with the same fear as before. He understood that consistency is the only tool capable of drilling through the rock of extreme poverty and bad luck. Instead of focusing on the million that was still far away, he focused on winning the next hour with total and absolute excellence. This focus on the present destroyed the power of tomorrow, turning now into his only and most powerful weapon of war. With every temptation overcome, Marcos felt that a new layer of strength was added to his once fragile soul. But destiny held one last lesson about what it really means to be a man of value and success. Marcos's silent effort finally began to break through the barrier of invisibility and generate fruits that the world could no longer ignore. That relentless discipline, which once seemed like an endless sacrifice, turned into a magnetic ability to attract the right opportunities. He no longer needed to chase money. His new posture and the value he delivered made resources flow toward him. Poverty, which once was an insurmountable wall, became just a distant memory of a life he no longer recognized. He discovered that wealth is a state of mind that inevitably overflows into the physical world. The change in his bank account was only a reflection of the deep change that occurred in his character and in his way of seeing the world. Marcos now walked with the confidence of someone who knows that his destiny is in his own hands and in his capacity for execution. He realized that the people around him no longer treated him with pity, but with genuine respect and even a certain admiration. He was no longer the man who promised for tomorrow. He was the man who delivered excellent results today without excuses or hesitation. "I will do it tomorrow" had died, giving way to a mindset of abundance that knew no limits or borders. Looking back, he understood that extreme poverty was merely the result of a series of decisions to postpone his own greatness out of fear. Now, sitting at a table where important decisions were made, he saw that success is a game of patience, strategy, and immediate action. The freedom he had always dreamed of was not in a lottery ticket, but in the courage to face the discomfort of each new day. He had become the entrepreneur of his own life, turning every past failure into a solid step toward his future empire. But the greatest secret of all is that this journey of transformation never truly comes to a definitive end. And you? How long will you continue feeding the monster of tomorrow while your life slips through your hands? The knowledge you have just absorbed will only have value if you decide right now to kill the procrastinating man or woman that lives inside you. The abyss between poverty and wealth is paved by the decisions you make today. What will you offer the world in exchange for the life you want to have? If you felt that this message was the reality check you needed, write, "I decide to act now" in the comments and share which tomorrow you will turn into today. Your change begins the moment you stop making excuses and start delivering results. Do not allow your greatness to be buried before it even blossoms. Subscribe to the channel now and activate notifications to ensure that you never fall asleep in standby mode again. Your journey to the top continues in the next video.